I spent 18 years planning my divorce. The morning sun streamed through the windows as I slid the envelope across the kitchen table toward Jack. His confused expression quickly turned to shock as he read the words, "divorce agreement," stamped across the top. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice laced with disbelief. I took a deep breath, my hand steady after years of imagining this moment. "It's exactly what it says," I replied. "Now that Sophie has turned 18 and is preparing for college, it's time for me to move on." Jack's face twisted with confusion and frustration. "Why now? After all these years?" he demanded, his tone edged with panic. I met his gaze, calm but firm. "Because I stayed for her, Jack. I couldn't let our daughter grow up in a broken home, but now she's ready to spread her wings. And I need to do the same." I saw the realization dawn on him, the years of my silent endurance, the meticulous preparation behind my decision. His protests began, but they felt hollow to me. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment choice. It was the culmination of 18 years of quiet resolve, each step planned for this very day, my liberation finally within reach. In the beginning, everything felt like a dream. Our wedding was a blur of love and promises, and I believed Jack and I were stepping into a future filled with endless possibilities. When I found out I was pregnant shortly after our honeymoon, the news felt like a divine blessing, a promise of the family we would build together. My heart swelled with hope as I imagined the life we'd create for our child. But the perfection didn't last. The first cracks appeared during the honeymoon. Jack's attention began to waver, his phone ringing constantly with work calls. At first, I brushed it off, reasoning that he was just ambitious and eager to secure our future. Yet, each time he excused himself to take another call, leaving me alone on moonlit dinners or scenic walks, I felt a pang of loneliness. The man who had vowed to cherish me seemed distracted, distant. By the time we returned home, I couldn't ignore the unease growing in my chest. Those early signs of detachment, seemingly insignificant at the time, marked the beginning of a pattern that would shape the years to come. What once felt like a shared dream was already slipping into isolation. The reality of my marriage began to unravel sooner than I could have imagined. It was just weeks after our honeymoon when I overheard Jack speaking on the phone late at night. His tone was soft, too familiar, and the words exchanged left little room for doubt. My stomach twisted as I pieced together the betrayal, the weight of it settling like a stone in my chest. I felt the world tilt beneath me, but my first thought wasn't anger or vengeance, it was my unborn child. Confronting Jack felt futile. I told myself that he would change once the baby arrived. That the responsibility of fatherhood would transform him into the husband I needed. So I stayed silent, swallowing the betrayal for the sake of the life growing inside me. But as my pregnancy progressed, so did Jack's detachment. The hope I had clung to began to fade with each passing day. Jack showed little interest in our future as a family. His focus remained steadfastly on his career, his endless meetings, and his personal pursuits. My emotional needs, my fears, and my dreams were met with indifference, brushed aside as trivial. The man I had married, the one who once made me feel like the center of his universe, had receded into someone I barely recognized. Each time I tried to bridge the gap between us, to voice my feelings or draw him into the joy of our upcoming parenthood, Jack's response was distant. "You're overthinking," he'd say. Or, "I'm doing this for us," as though his absence could be justified by a paycheck or an excuse. Alone, I wrestled with the growing chasm in our marriage, trapped in a house that echoed with the silence of unspoken truths. The cracks in my marriage deepened as the years passed, each one carving a chasm that felt insurmountable. Jack's indifference wasn't confined to a single moment or a singular betrayal. It was woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. He consistently forgot important dates, our anniversaries, my birthdays, milestones that should have been celebrations of our life together. Each missed acknowledgement left me feeling invisible, as though my presence in his life was an afterthought. When Sophie was born, I held on to the hope that parenthood might awaken something in Jack. Something that would draw us closer. But those late-night feedings, those moments when I needed his partnership the most, were met with excuses. He claimed exhaustion from work, retreating to the bedroom while I rocked Sophie through her cries or rushed her to the pediatrician alone. The weight of being the only one truly present for our child bore down on me. Each moment a stark reminder of how absent Jack was in our family. Even my personal victories, the achievements that brought me pride, were met with dismissal. When I earned a promotion at work, one I had sacrificed so much to achieve, Jack barely acknowledged it. "That's nice," he had said, without even glancing up from his phone. "No big deal, right?" The words stung. Not just because they minimized my hard work, but because they epitomized how little space I occupied in his world. Jack's disregard extended beyond our private lives and seeped into our social and family circles. Family gatherings, moments meant to create memories and foster connection, were often marred by his absence. He'd decline invitations with vague excuses, leaving me to navigate the questions and the awkward glances alone. Over time, I stopped trying to defend him, stopped pretending that his absence was anything other than what it was, a reflection of his priorities. Every interaction, every forgotten moment, chipped away at the foundation of our marriage. It wasn't just his actions, it was the silence that followed, the lack of acknowledgement or effort to repair what was breaking. I was no longer a partner in Jack's life. I was a placeholder, a convenience he took for granted. And the worst part? I had let it happen, believing that if I just tried harder, he might finally see me. Taking control of my life didn't come as a sudden epiphany but as a quiet resolution that grew stronger with every day of neglect and disregard. I realized that waiting for Jack to change was futile. If I wanted a better future for myself and for Sophie, I had to create it myself. That decision marked the beginning of an 18-year plan to reclaim my independence. One step at a time. I started small, careful not to draw Jack's attention. From my part-time job, I began setting aside small amounts of money, opening a secret bank account under my name. Each deposit, no matter how modest, felt like a declaration of freedom. It wasn't just about the money, it was about building a safety net, ensuring that when the time came, I wouldn't have to depend on Jack for anything. I also started documenting his behavior. Every forgotten anniversary, every dismissive comment about my achievements, every night he left me to manage Sophie alone, I wrote it all down. It wasn't just a way to validate my own experiences but also to prepare for the day when I might need these records for legal proceedings. I wanted to ensure that if I ever walked away, I would do so with the power to protect myself and Sophie. My focus shifted entirely to Sophie. She became my anchor, the reason I endured and persevered. I poured my energy into creating a stable and loving environment for her, making sure she felt the support and attention that Jack couldn't provide. Whether it was helping her with school projects, attending her recitals, or simply being there for bedtime stories, I made sure she knew she was never alone. It wasn't easy, living a double life under Jack's roof. Every interaction felt like a performance, masking the resentment simmering beneath the surface. But each step toward independence strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just surviving, I was planning, preparing for the day when Sophie would be grown, and I could finally walk away without looking back. Each moment of neglect and indifference from Jack became a chapter in the story of my resolve. For years, I endured the subtle and overt ways he dismissed not only me but the life we had built together. These were not isolated incidents but recurring patterns, each one solidifying my decision to one day walk away. I remember Sophie's first piano recital as though it happened yesterday. She had practiced so diligently, her small fingers moving clumsily at first and then confidently over the keys as she mastered her piece. Her excitement was infectious, she couldn't wait to see Jack's proud smile as she performed. He had promised to be there, swearing that nothing would stop him. But as the other parents filled the seats around me, their faces glowing with pride and anticipation, Jack's chair next to me remained empty. Sophie kept glancing toward the door, her hopeful expression dimming each time it swung open and revealed another stranger. She played beautifully that night, but her joy was dimmed by the absence of the one person she most wanted to impress. When I asked Jack about it later, his response was perfunctory: a work emergency had come up. The way he brushed it off, as though Sophie's disappointment was trivial, cut deeper than any excuse he could have given. Our 10th wedding anniversary should have been a milestone worth celebrating. I had spent weeks planning a special evening, determined to create a moment that could remind us both of why we started this journey together. Jack, however, arrived home late, distracted, and empty-handed save for a generic gift card he tossed onto the counter. There was no thoughtful note, no flowers, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices and struggles that had carried us through a decade. As he sat down to work on his laptop during the dinner I had lovingly prepared, I realized that the men I had once looked to for partnership now barely registered my existence. Then there were the countless nights when Jack would bring his colleagues home unannounced, disrupting what little semblance of normalcy our household had. I would be in the middle of bedtime routines with Sophie or trying to catch up on my own work when he'd appear at the door. A group of suited strangers trailing behind him. He would expect the house to be immaculate, a meal to be prepared, and me to host with a gracious smile. "It's important for business," he'd say, as though that absolved him of the imposition. There was never a thank you, never a moment of acknowledgement for the effort it took to transform chaos into order at a moment's notice. Instead, I was left to feel like an accessory to his career, a silent partner in his successes but never a recipient of his gratitude. These moments weren't just disappointments. They were reminders that Jack saw me as a function of his life rather than a partner in it. His dismissiveness extended beyond his neglect of me to our daughter, Sophie, who grew up accustomed to his broken promises and fleeting attention. Each recital he missed, each milestone he downplayed, and each time he prioritized his work or his own interests over our family was another nail in the coffin of our marriage. But I didn't lash out or crumble under the weight of his neglect. Instead, I began to plan. I told myself that if Jack couldn't be the partner I needed, I would at least ensure Sophie had the stability and care she deserved. I focused on creating a warm, loving environment for her, even as Jack's detachment loomed over us. I quietly saved money, opened a secret bank account, and started documenting his behavior each missed event. Each dismissive remark, each moment of indifference. These weren't just grievances, they were evidence, a foundation for the freedom I was determined to reclaim. Sophie became my purpose. And her happiness was the light that kept me moving forward. I didn't want her to grow up thinking this was what love looked like, an endless cycle of disappointment and neglect. I wanted her to see strength, to understand that love should uplift, not diminish. Jack's indifference didn't just push me away, it fueled a fire within me, one that grew brighter with each passing year. I resolved that as soon as Sophie was old enough to understand, I would leave this hollow shell of a marriage and show her what it meant to choose oneself. Each moment of Jack's disregard became not just a reason to leave but a reminder of the life I wanted to build for myself and my daughter, a life free from his neglect. Filled instead with love, respect, and purpose. And so, I waited, knowing that one day, when the time was right, I would finally break free. The years passed, and my world became centered on Sophie. From the moment she took her first steps, I vowed to give her every opportunity, every ounce of love, and every bit of strength she would need to thrive. I threw myself into her education. Attending every parent-teacher conference, cheering her on at every recital, and sitting proudly in the bleachers during her soccer games. My schedule revolved around her needs, ensuring she knew she was supported and loved unconditionally. Jack's involvement, however, remained peripheral. He rarely attended school events, often citing late meetings or urgent business trips as excuses. When Sophie would look into the crowd at her recitals, searching for him, I'd feel the weight of her disappointment. I made up excuses for him, brushing it off with vague reassurances that he was proud of her, even when his absence said otherwise. Each missed event was another crack in my resolve to stay, but I hid my frustration behind a carefully curated facade. To Sophie, her father was busy but dependable. And I made sure she never saw the resentment building within me. My devotion to Sophie became my purpose, a way to make sense of the choices I had made. I stayed silent about the void in my marriage, refusing to let it bleed into her world. While Jack buried himself in his work, I poured everything into Sophie. I helped her with science projects, practiced multiplication tables, and made sure her birthdays were filled with laughter and friends, even if Jack only remembered to send a card. But it wasn't just the absence of his presence, it was the absence of his effort that stung the most. When Sophie brought home an art project she was proud of, Jack barely glanced at it before nodding dismissively. When she scored the winning goal at her soccer match, his congratulations were a quick pat on the back, more perfunctory than heartfelt. I could see it in Sophie's eyes, the quiet longing for a father who would celebrate her victories with the same enthusiasm I did. As she grew older, Sophie became a reflection of my efforts. She was confident and kind, excelling in her classes and forming friendships that brought her joy. Yet, she remained blissfully unaware of the silent tension that defined my relationship with Jack. I made sure of it. I shielded her from the arguments, from the nights I spent crying in the kitchen after Jack dismissed another family moment as not that important. To her, we were a normal family. And perhaps, in some ways, we were at least on the surface. There were moments when I wondered if Sophie could sense the cracks beneath the surface. Once, after a particularly heated but hushed argument with Jack, Sophie hugged me tightly and said, "I love you, Mom. You're the best." Her words were a balm to the wounds I hid so carefully. But they also reminded me of the sacrifices I had made. I was her rock, her constant, and I refused to let her down. Through it all, I stayed. For her. My love for Sophie was what kept me tethered to a marriage that had long lost its meaning. I knew the day would come when she would be ready to step into the world on her own, and on that day, I would finally let go of the facade. Until then, I wore my strength like armor. Determined to give her the stable foundation she deserved, even if it meant burying my own desires and dreams. Sophie became my beacon, the reason I endured Jack's indifference and neglect. Every achievement of hers felt like a small victory for us both, a reminder that my sacrifices weren't in vain. But deep down, I knew the truth: my marriage to Jack was nothing more than a shell. And one day, for Sophie's sake and my own, I would have to walk away. Until that day arrived, I would continue to play the role of the devoted wife and mother, even as the cracks in my world threatened to break me. Jack sat at the dining table, his face pale and drawn as he read through the divorce papers. The disbelief etched across his features might have once softened my resolve, but not today. I stood across from him, my arms crossed and my gaze steady. The silence between us was thick, punctuated only by the faint rustle of paper as he flipped through the documents. His hands trembling. Finally, Jack looked up, his eyes searching mine for an explanation. "You're really going through with this?" he asked, his voice incredulous. I took a deep breath. Steadying myself. "Yes, Jack. I am." My voice was calm, but beneath it lay 18 years of buried frustration and unspoken hurt. "I gave you 18 years to show me that you could be a partner, a father, and someone I could trust. You failed at all three." His jaw tightened, and his face flushed with indignation. "I provided for this family," he shot back, his tone defensive. "I worked hard to give you and Sophie everything you needed. Financial support isn't the same as love or partnership," I countered, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain composed. "Yes, you provided money, but that's where it ended. You were absent, Jack. Emotionally, physically, you were never there when it mattered." He shook his head, his disbelief morphing into anger. "I worked late for us, Emily. For Sophie. Someone had to pay the bills. And someone had to raise her." I snapped, my calm exterior finally cracking. Someone had to be there for her recitals, her doctor's appointments, her school events. Someone had to pick up the pieces every time she asked why her dad wasn't there. That someone was me, Jack. Not you. He recoiled as though I'd struck him. But I pressed on. "You might have been in the house, but you were never truly part of this family. I stayed for Sophie because she deserved stability, but now she's grown, and I won't sacrifice any more of myself for a marriage that's been over for years." Jack stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a rebuttal, but no words came. The weight of my words hung heavy in the air, a reckoning long overdue. I didn't wait for him to respond. I picked up my bag and headed for the door, pausing only to look back one last time. "This isn't just about what you did or didn't do, Jack. It's about what I deserve, and I deserve better." With that, I left the room, leaving him alone with the papers and the truth he could no longer ignore. Jack's face darkened as he pushed the divorce papers aside, his voice sharp with accusation. "You're unbelievable, Emily. Do you even realize how hard I worked to give you and Sophie a comfortable life? All those late nights, the endless hours, they were for you. And this is how you repay me." I stood my ground, refusing to let his words chip away at the resolve I'd built over nearly 2 decades. "Jack, do you really think money makes up for everything? That throwing a paycheck at our family erases years of neglect?" My voice was steady. But beneath it, a lifetime of bottled frustration threatened to spill over. "You worked late, yes, but you weren't working for us, you were working for yourself, for your career. For your own ego. And while you were doing that, I was here. I was the one making sure Sophie felt loved, supported, and safe. I was the one holding everything together. He scoffed. His hands clenched into fists on the table. So now I'm the villain for trying to provide. I thought we were a team, Emily. I shook my head, my tone soft but unyielding. A team. A team shares the load. Jack. A team supports each other, emotionally and otherwise. I needed a partner, but you left me to do it all. Late-night feedings, school projects, doctor visits, every moment Sophie needed her dad. You weren't there. And I stayed silent, Jack. I stayed silent because I thought it would get better, but it never did. Jack leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. So that's it. You're walking away from everything we've built. You're giving up. No, Jack, I said firmly, meeting his gaze. I'm not giving up. I'm finally choosing myself. I've given 18 years to this marriage, 18 years of sacrifice, of putting Sophie's needs first. Of putting my own happiness last. But I'm done waiting for a change that's never coming. He stared at me, searching for the cracks in my determination, but there were none. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice as I continued. This isn't impulsive, Jack. I've planned for this. I've saved, I've prepared, and I know exactly what my next steps are. I'm moving out. Sophie will always have both of us in her life. But this marriage is over. For a moment, Jack looked like he might argue, but then he sank back into his chair, his expression shifting from anger to something else, perhaps realization. Perhaps defeat. I didn't wait for him to respond. I had said everything I needed to say. It was time to leave the silence and emptiness of our life together behind. When Sophie found out about the divorce, her reaction was exactly what I had feared. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at me, disbelief clouding her face. Why now, Mom? Why break everything apart now? She asked, her voice trembling. The weight of her emotions pressed heavily on me, but I knew this conversation had to happen. Sophie, I began, choosing my words carefully. I stayed as long as I did for you. I wanted to give you a stable childhood, a home where you felt secure. But I can't stay in a marriage that has taken so much from me and given so little back. She frowned, confusion mixing with hurt. I don't understand. Dad always made sure we had everything we needed. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. He did, Sophie, but there's more to a family than just providing. I needed a partner, someone who would share the responsibilities, who would care for me as much as I cared for them. But your father, he wasn't that person. And for years, I convinced myself it was enough to endure for your sake. But I've realized something, staying in a marriage where I felt invisible wasn't a lesson I wanted to pass down to you. Sophie's expression softened, though her brows remained furrowed. You're saying you stayed unhappy because of me? No, I said firmly, reaching for her hand. I stayed because I love you, and I thought it was the right thing to do. But I see now that teaching you to value yourself, to set boundaries, and to demand respect is just as important as providing stability. I don't want you to think that love means sacrificing who you are. Sophie sat quietly for a moment, her gaze dropping to the floor. Then, slowly, she looked back at me, her voice steady but quiet. I hate that you felt like this for so long, Mom. But I understand. And I'm proud of you for doing this. For choosing yourself. Her words unlocked something in me, a flood of relief and validation. I hadn't realized how much I had needed her support until she gave it to me. Thank you. Sophie, I whispered, pulling her into a hug. I just want you to know that no matter what happens, you'll always come first. As we sat together, the weight of years of silence began to lift. In that moment, I saw the woman Sophie was becoming strong, compassionate, and wise beyond her years. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope for both our futures. As I sat in my new apartment, a cozy space filled with warm light and quiet serenity, I allowed myself to exhale fully for the first time in years. The past 18 years of planning had been grueling. A silent endurance of emotional neglect and loneliness. Yet, as I unpacked boxes and placed reminders of my journey on the shelves, I realized this wasn't just about leaving Jack. It was about rediscovering myself, about remembering the woman I had been before our marriage, and finally stepping into the version of me I had long suppressed. The apartment wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every framed photo, felt like a symbol of my liberation. For decades, I had carried the weight of a loveless marriage, pretending for Sophie's sake. But now I felt lighter, freer. A few weeks later, standing at Sophie's college orientation, I watched her laugh with new friends, her face lit with the excitement of her future. I smiled, knowing I had given her stability and strength. And now, as I looked ahead, I saw a future of my own, one filled with hope, freedom, and a renewed sense of who I was meant to be.